Okay, so we're just moving right along, and here we are on to chapter 6. So in chapter 6, he's going to be discussing the path that a ruler should take in forming a new government. And here you can also see that he's looking to the great rulers of the past for guidance. So here's a quote in which he expresses this very clearly. A prudent man, in other words, a careful man, should always enter those paths taken by great men and imitate those who have been most excellent. He goes on in this quote, in this passage, to give the analogy of an archer who's looking at a distant target and how a smart archer or a good archer will aim higher in order to hit a distant target. So he's saying here that perhaps as a ruler, you're not as good as these most excellent rulers of the past. So what you should do is you should aim your sights high, and that way you'll likely hit the target of being a good ruler. And, he goes on to say, you should never, and I know I keep saying this, but it's important, you should never rely on fortune. And here he gives almost a rhyme, so it's easy to remember. He says, he who relies upon fortune less maintains his position best. So that's fairly easy to remember, right? It's like a nice bumper sticker. He who relies upon fortune less maintains his position best. And, he says, fortune, however, may be necessary in obtaining power. So here's the passage in which he discusses that. He says, they, as in previous rulers, they received nothing more from fortune except the opportunity, which gave them the material that they could mold into whatever form they desired. Without that opportunity, the strength of their spirit would have been extinguished. And without strength, the opportunity would have come in vain. So again, he's saying that some people who became rulers could only become rulers because they had the opportunity. And if they didn't have the opportunity, then they might have never become rulers, and their spirit would have been extinguished. They would have faded away. But without strength, opportunity can be wasted. So you always have to be strong enough to capitalize on opportunity. On to chapter 7. This deals with how to best use violence. Now we're getting exciting. He says the best way to use violence is to do so quickly and decisively. You don't want to get more violent over time. He says you don't want to start out slowly and then over time get more violent, because then the people are going to start to become resentful. But if you do it quickly and decisively, and then you're good to the people afterwards, they'll forget how you came to power through perhaps some horrible thing that you did. So he says here, well used are those cruelties that are carried out in a single stroke, done out of necessity to protect oneself, and are not continued, but are instead converted into the greatest possible benefits for the subjects. Badly used cruelties grow with time instead of disappearing. So you want to avoid the people disliking you. You want to avoid the people, above all things, and we're going to mention this in a little bit, above all things, you want to avoid the people hating you. So, on to chapter 12. He lays out the principal foundations of states, which he says are good laws and good armies. So both good laws and good armies are the key to stability and a state's survival. So good laws and the ability to enforce them will lead to more internal or domestic stability, and good armies should protect the state from invaders on the outside. So good laws and good armies, he says, are the key to survival. And a wise ruler is always aware of change and is flexible and knows when to change laws. So being a realist for Machiavelli doesn't mean that you just sort of say, this is just the way things are. You're not stubborn. You're open-minded. You're analytical. You're almost scientific in the way you govern. So remember, during the Renaissance, this is a time of discovery. Machiavelli lived on the cusp of the scientific revolution, and he approaches government through the lens of science. And so a good ruler, a smart ruler, is going to always be aware of the way things are changing and adjust to those changes. So, what makes a good army? One that's willing to die for you. And he says mercenary armies are only interested in money. He says that they're cowardly, though they act like they're brave. They're the most cowardly. They're only interested in themselves. They're only interested in money. But if you can get an army of civilians, of citizens, rather, get an army of citizens, those are the best. And in order to do this, in order to create a military made up of citizens, the prince or the ruler must not be hated. You want people to be willing to die for you. If they hate you, they're not going to be willing to die for you. The people must have some freedom, and there must be stability so that people have decent lives. Now, this passage right here in chapter 12 in which he argues this is really important, because what he's talking about here is a type of social contract. Here, I think, illustrates that Machiavelli gets kind of a bad rap as being overly violent, as being untruthful, as doing anything that you need to do in order to gain power. But what realism does here is it also says that in order for you to maintain power, you have to actually be pretty good to the citizens of the society. You can't be hated, so you need to do what you can to prevent that, because hate will motivate people to try to kill you. So obviously you can't hold power if somebody kills you. The people have to have some freedom. If they don't have any freedom, they're not going to be willing to die for you. And there also must be stability. So you need to create a stable environment for people in which people can live. So people need to feel as though they have some skin in the game, both figuratively and in this concept or in this example, literally, that they're willing to die for you. They're not going to be willing to die for you if you're horrible to them. So I think this is kind of an interesting twist that is often overlooked when people talk about Machiavelli. And one of the reasons that I like Machiavelli so much, because I think he's somewhat misunderstood. On to chapters 15 through 18, in which he's going to be answering some questions about how to maintain power. So he sets up the argument. Many writers have imagined for themselves republics, that have never been seen or known to exist. So, right off the bat, from what we've read, this should remind us of Plato's Republic, right? For there is such a gap between how one lives and how one ought to live, that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. So, here he is very clear. You should always focus on the way things are, or the way things are done, rather than the way things should be done. So, the first issue that he comes up with, or the first question that he's going to answer, should a prince be generous or miserly? The prince should be miserly, in other words, not too generous. And the reason that he gives is that too much generosity will lead to raising taxes. And if you have to raise taxes on the people, they will come to hate you. So here you see an example of being careful or prudent rather than extravagant. Issue number 2. Should he be cruel or show mercy? You should be seen as merciful. Remember, you need to avoid being hated. But if you need to be cruel in order to hold on to power, you shouldn't be prevented from doing that. So the key here is to maintaining power and stability. So again, you should be seen as merciful, but you shouldn't let that prevent you from being cruel if you need to be cruel in maintaining power. So the first 2 issues, should the prince be generous or miserly, or should the prince be cruel or show mercy? Issue number 3, should the prince be loved or feared? This is such a great question. Is it better to be loved or feared? It's much better to be feared than loved when one is lacking. So the reason for this, he gives, is that people are willing to double cross the people that they love much more quickly than people are willing to double cross those whom they fear. So if you can be loved, that's great. He doesn't say you shouldn't be loved. He just says if you have to choose between the two, it's better to be feared than to be loved. But again, never be hated, because hatred is too much of a motivating factor. People will try to kill you if they hate you. So it's better to be feared than loved if you can only choose one, but you want to avoid being hated. Issue number 4, should the prince keep his word? And he says that not if it's a disadvantage to do so. So if you can keep your word, that's fine. But if keeping your word is going to create a disadvantage for you, then you shouldn't do it. And he says, however, you should be a good liar and a good hypocrite. Continued. A prince cannot observe all those things which for men are considered good. For in order to maintain the state, he is often obliged to act against his promise, against charity, against humanity, and against religion. And here I will make an argument that the prince that Machiavelli is talking about is somewhat of a tragic character. Because if you look at the history of this time, the context of this time, I should say, this is a time in which people were very religious and believed strongly in the Catholic Church in things like heaven and hell, and sinning is a way to go to hell. And the prince has to sacrifice being a sinner in order to maintain stability in the state. And I think that because of that, there can be an argument made that the prince is somewhat of a tragic figure, a tragic character. Chapter 25, Machiavelli discusses fortune. Again, never expect it, be prepared for its arrival. It also reveals his position on agency. So here is where he's going to talk about the idea of fortune. Chapter 25. Chapter 25. So Machiavelli in this chapter discusses fortune. And again, I know that I've said this several times now, never expect it. Be prepared for its arrival. And also in this passage, and the reason that I'm bringing this up is not just for the bit on fortune, but it also reveals his position, Machiavelli's position on human agency, that we have the power to act outside of the forces of God or the forces of luck. And here's what he says in this passage. Many hold the opinion that things of this world are controlled by fortune and by God, that men cannot control them. I judge it to be true that fortune is the arbiter of one half of our actions, but that she still leaves the control of the other half. So in other words, again, humans have agency. We shouldn't just pray for certain outcomes. We shouldn't just hope for certain outcomes. We should work towards those outcomes. And this is a very influential way of thinking, because this is before the scientific revolution, this is before the Enlightenment, and it really illustrates this rebirth or Renaissance mentality that people can be proactive, people do have agency, and this is going to go on to influence the next theorists that we're going to discuss. And with that, I will leave you for the week. And I hope that you found this discussion on the prince to be helpful. I hope that you found it as interesting as I find this particular author. And I wish you all the very, very best. So long until next week.